No one remembered the colony's original name. When the storm hit, it erased everything: maps, records, even memories. Only the designation stuck: Outpost Epsilon 9, a barren stretch of red rock and toxic winds on the rim of the Proxima Line. It was meant to be the first human foothold into the Reach. Soft skins, the Calthari observers used to call them, lounging in their armored suits behind observation shields while the human teams unloaded cargo. To the Reach species, humans were an anomaly. No natural armor, no chitin plates, no thickened skin to withstand radiation or atmospheric shifts, just exposed soft flesh, prone to breaking under pressure. Thomas Hale heard them laugh. He heard them the day the sky cracked. It started with a shudder, a low vibration that rattled tools against metal decking. Thomas was bent over a power relay, recalibrating its dampeners after the third fluctuation of the week. Another surge, he muttered to himself. His fingers moved quickly, rewiring the unit. Then the ground rolled under him like a wave, slamming his shoulder against the bulkhead. The lights flickered, the emergency klaxons howled. A red plume of energy shot into the sky from the western ridge, splitting the clouds in jagged lines. Moments later, the first acid rain hissed against the dome shielding, followed by a tremor that cracked the foundation plates. "Evac order," someone shouted. Thomas staggered to his feet. Outside the port window, he saw them. The armored Calthari, the bulbous-headed Yuri, the hard-plated Chirul. They scrambled into their ships, activating heavy shields as if the air itself would strip them bare. Their vessels lifted from the ground, thrusters igniting dust storms beneath them. But the humans weren't so lucky. The escape ships were down. A power overload had fried their launch systems. Those on the outer rim, technicians, miners, and a few environmental scientists, were trapped. "Tom!" someone yelled over the comms. It was Carson, a geologist stationed at the southern excavation pit. "The outflow valves are shot. If we don't get them sealed, the acid's going to flood the lower levels." Thomas didn't hesitate. He grabbed his toolkit, slamming it against his side as he ran. Outside, the air shimmered with toxic heat. The radiation spikes made the exposed ground ripple like boiling water. Thomas wrapped his arm in an emergency sleeve, cinching it tight to protect the skin, but the acid rain still seared through, biting into his exposed neck and face. The valves were twisted, half melted from the storm's initial pulse. Carson was already there, prying at one with a rusted bar. His hands were bleeding, raw from the effort. "We need a lever," Thomas said. He scanned the debris, grabbing a broken support strut from a collapsed relay tower. Together they wedged it between the valve's base and the frame, pressing down with their combined weight. The valve groaned, metal tearing, but it sealed with a final grinding snap. The immediate threat of flooding receded, though acid continued to pool at their feet, burning through their boots. "Thanks," Carson panted, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "We're going to need more than that if we're staying alive down here." Thomas looked around. The others, Sarah, Briggs, even young Henry from the survey team, were gathering what supplies they could. First aid kits were cracked open, oxygen tanks were scavenged from ruptured storage lockers, tools were stripped from destroyed relay stations. "Get everyone into the underground levels," Thomas ordered. "We'll use the old maintenance tunnels. They're reinforced, might hold long enough for the radiation to die down." "Rescue'll be here in hours, right?" Henry asked, his voice trembling. Thomas met his eyes. "We plan for days, not hours, and we prepare for it to be weeks if it comes to that." Above them, the sky bled red and orange. Acid poured like a monsoon. Radiation levels spiked higher with every reading. Thomas tightened his makeshift sleeve and led the way into the maintenance shafts. Inside, the tunnels were narrow, filled with stale air and emergency lights flickering. But they were dry, for now. They barricaded the entrances with debris, sealing the tunnels against the encroaching acid. They mapped out the internal ventilation systems, improvising filters with soaked rags and chemical neutralizers from the labs. Food was scarce, rationed to bare necessities. Days bled into each other. Thomas organized shifts. some to keep the barriers reinforced, others to scavenge through the wreckage topside during brief lulls in the storm. They returned scorched, coughing up blood, but with oxygen canisters, thermal blankets, and salvageable rations. Henry's arm was broken in 2 places when a gravity shift toppled a storage beam. Sarah wrapped it with makeshift splints, binding it with lengths of stripped wiring. Briggs, a technician from Nevada, lost his footing on a slick of chemical residue and burned his leg down to the bone. They cut away the ruined flesh and kept it clean with alcohol wipes. He survived the infection, though he screamed through the nights. Carson and Thomas made a pact. No one would be left behind. If someone fell, the others would carry them. "We're soft skins," Carson joked bitterly one night, his lips cracked and bleeding. "But we're the last ones standing down here." Thomas clenched his jaw. "Not just standing, we're surviving." Then the second wave of gravity shifts struck. They huddled together in the deepest part of the tunnels, listening to the groaning metal above them. The world outside twisted and buckled, but they stayed. They reinforced the ceiling supports with scavenged beams, lashed together with wire and fragments of polymer. They used every trick of engineering they could remember. And through it all, they never stopped. When the others would have fled, Thomas led. When the Reach species abandoned them, he carried the weight of broken men and women on his back. His hands were a map of torn flesh, raw from hauling beams, scorched from acid burns. But his grip never failed, and above them, the sky wept acid. But below, in the tunnels of Outpost Epsilon 9, the humans remained. Alive, waiting. Time was a blur in the tunnels. The flickering emergency lights did little to mark the passage of days, but Thomas counted every cycle of his watch, every shift in the tremors above. The storm outside hadn't weakened. If anything, it grew more violent. The acid rains deepened the scars of the colony, cutting trenches where streets had once been, corroding the few remaining structures into warped skeletons. Inside, the survivors were running on grit and desperation. The food rations dwindled faster than Thomas anticipated. They stretched what they could. Water filters cobbled from lab equipment, protein supplements scraped from med packs, even emergency glucose gels once used for field treatments. Sarah, the biologist, managed to grow a small colony of fungus cultures from spores found in storage. It wasn't much, but it gave them something extra, a bit of sustenance beyond the processed rations. They took turns boiling the fungus into thin broth. The taste was awful, but it kept them from starvation. Henry's arm wasn't healing right. The fracture was too severe, and his skin had turned a mottled purple along the break line. Thomas knew infection was taking root. "We're going to have to clean it deeper," he said quietly. Henry's face turned as pale as the emergency lights, but he nodded. Sarah and Carson held him down as Thomas heated a salvaged piece of metal over a torch. The smell of burning flesh filled the narrow space, but Henry didn't pass out. When it was done, they wrapped the wound tight and gave him the last dose of painkillers they had. "You're tougher than you look," Thomas said, wiping his bloodied hands on his torn sleeves. "I'm soft-skinned," Henry whispered back, voice cracked but defiant. Thomas grinned faintly. Meanwhile, topside recon became increasingly dangerous. Radiation bursts triggered random surges of gravity fields, making the terrain unpredictable and deadly. Sarah and Carson risked a trip to the old mining depot to retrieve a collapsed crate rumored to contain emergency oxygen tanks. They returned 2 days later, limping and half-covered in acid burns, but they brought back the crate. Inside, they found not only oxygen tanks, but several containers of medical supplies, burn dressings, antiseptics, and a single auto-injector of advanced coagulant. It was a treasure trove. Thomas distributed the supplies carefully, rationing even the antiseptics. "We're not dead yet," he said to the group, his voice rough but steady, "and we're not going to let this place finish us off." They set up a makeshift infirmary in the lowest chamber of the tunnels, lining the walls with scavenged insulation material to shield from radiation leaks. Sarah tended to burns with trembling hands, and Carson repurposed lab equipment into crude diagnostic tools to monitor vitals. Through it all, Thomas kept moving, reinforcing barriers, shoring up supports, marking paths for safe traversal in case another quake hit. He slept little, waking often to check radiation levels and air quality. Once, during a rare moment of quiet, he caught a glimpse of himself in a cracked panel. His face was gaunt, streaked with grime, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. His hands trembled from overwork and malnutrition. But behind the hollow look, he saw something else. A fire that hadn't gone out. Briggs, whose burned leg had become a rallying point for their struggle, limped over to sit beside him. "How much longer, you think?" he asked, voice rough. "As long as it takes," Thomas answered. Briggs laughed bitterly. "They called us weak, you know. Back at the briefing station, the Calthari captain said we wouldn't last a week in reach conditions without our tech. I'd love to see his face now." Thomas's mouth twitched into a grim smile. If he's still alive, he's probably hiding under a reinforced deck somewhere, waiting for someone else to fix the problem. They heard a low rumble overhead. Dust trickled from the ceiling as the world above shifted once more, but the tunnels held. It was Sarah who first noticed the changes in the storm. On the 5th week, the radiation levels dipped slightly. The acid rain slowed, the air readings shifting just enough to suggest the storm's core was weakening. "There's a window coming," she said. "Might be a day, might be less. But if we can get topside, we could signal any passing ships." Thomas gathered the survivors. "We'll split into 2 teams," he said. "One to prepare a beacon, the other to stay here and keep the tunnels stable. If we can't get help, we're going to need a way back down here." Carson, Briggs, and Henry volunteered for the beacon team. Sarah stayed below with the others, tending to the sick and maintaining their fragile defenses. Thomas led the way topside. The air was clearer, but still heavy with the sting of acid. They rigged the beacon with salvaged components, an old comm tower relay, repurposed power cells, and a makeshift antenna cobbled from broken drones. They powered it up, sending a signal pulse into the dark sky. The signal was weak, but it was persistent, a desperate voice crying out from the wreckage of Epsilon 9. For hours they waited, huddled beneath a tattered shelter while the winds screamed around them. Just when hope seemed to flicker, the receiver cracked to life. A garbled voice echoed through the static. "This is the Nansen, response vessel from high orbit. We received your signal. Hold position. Evac in progress. ETA." The message cut off in a burst of interference. But the words were enough. Thomas felt his knees buckle. He pressed a hand to the antenna, closing his eyes. "We made it," Briggs whispered hoarsely. But Thomas's mind was already racing. The storm might be weakening, but the colony was still collapsing. And if the rescue ships were coming, they had to be ready to reach them. "We're not done yet," Thomas said grimly. "Get everyone topside. We leave nothing behind." The survivors gathered their meager supplies, bundled the injured in makeshift stretchers, and prepared for the final push. Outside, the storm roared its last defiance, and the sky began to clear. When Thomas led the survivors topside, the world outside the tunnels looked like a shattered dream. The ground was warped, pockmarked by acid craters and streaked with deep fissures where gravity shifts had torn the earth apart. The colony buildings were gone, reduced to melted frames and smoldering rubble. Even the air shimmered with residual radiation, waves of heat distorting the light. But the storm had relented. The sky, while still bruised with red and orange clouds, showed patches of pale blue beyond. "We move fast," Thomas said, tightening the makeshift straps of a salvage pack on his shoulders. "The window won't last long." They formed a line, carrying stretchers and salvage packs, hauling the wounded through the wreckage. Briggs, despite his burned leg, insisted on walking. Henry, his arm still bound in splints, held a cracked comm unit close to his ear, listening for any signal from the rescue ship. They reached the central landing zone, or what was left of it. The once flat pad was split and uneven, with jagged slabs of concrete rising like broken teeth from the ground. Acid pools hissed in the craters, and wind whipped fine dust into their eyes and lungs. Thomas looked around. The old comm tower, now partially collapsed, still pulsed faintly with the emergency beacon they'd reactivated. A single flickering light blinked through the haze. "We need a flare," Sarah said, coughing as she adjusted the strap of her pack. Thomas dug through a scavenged satchel and pulled out a flare gun, its casing corroded but still functional. He aimed it high, pulling the trigger. A burst of bright orange streaked into the sky, arching against the ragged clouds. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a low hum filled the air. It was faint at first, a vibration beneath their feet, but it grew steadily louder. A shape emerged from the clouds. A ship, its hull gleaming silver despite the grime of re-entry. "The Nansen," Henry whispered, his voice cracking with relief. The ship descended, retro thrusters kicking up waves of dust and debris. Its landing struts crunched against the fractured pad. The ramp extended, and figures in reinforced suits hurried down, waving to the survivors. "Stay put," one of them shouted over a loudspeaker. "We've got you." Thomas turned to the group. "Help each other. No one gets left behind." They moved as a unit, carrying stretchers and wounded, supporting one another through the broken ground. The rescue crew met them halfway, distributing masks and shielding blankets, administering stabilizers to those most injured. Briggs nearly collapsed when a medic caught him under the arm, but he grinned despite the pain. "Told you we'd make it," he rasped. Sarah leaned against a medic's shoulder, exhausted but upright. Henry, still gripping the comm unit like a lifeline, finally let it drop to his side, tears streaking through the grime on his face. When the last of the survivors were aboard the Nansen, Thomas was the last to step onto the ramp. He turned back, looking over the desolate expanse of what had once been Epsilon 9. The Reach species had fled. They'd left humans to die in the acid rain and bone-crushing gravity, but here they stood, bruised, battered, but unbroken. "Ready to lift," the pilot called from the cockpit. Thomas nodded. "Take us up." The ship's engines rumbled to life, lifting them into the sky. Below, the colony shrank into a scarred landscape, broken and abandoned. Inside the Nansen, the survivors were given seats, blankets, food, and clean water. Medics worked quickly, tending to burns, splinting fractures, stabilizing vital signs. Thomas sat quietly against the bulkhead, his hands trembling from exhaustion. Across from him, Sarah offered a faint smile. "You did it," she said. "No," Thomas replied, voice hoarse. "We did." He looked around the compartment, at Briggs, Henry, Carson, and the others. Scarred, tired, some barely conscious, but they were alive. And that was more than anyone had believed possible. A communication officer approached, kneeling beside him. "We've established contact with High Orbit Command. They're sending additional ships for recovery. There's also a message from the Calthari delegation. They're requesting a report on human survival capabilities under Reach-level catastrophic conditions." Thomas's laugh was sharp, edged with exhaustion and bitter amusement. "Tell them to come down and see for themselves." The officer hesitated, then nodded and moved away. As the Nansen cleared the storm's edge and broke into cleaner skies, Thomas allowed himself to close his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he let the tension ease from his body. They had survived. Not because of scales or armor or hardened exoskeletons, because they were human, because they had each other, and because when the world collapsed around them, they stood together, carrying the wounded, holding each other upright, facing death with bleeding hands and broken bones. When the Reach species abandoned them, they adapted. And when rescue finally arrived, it found only one species still standing. Human. The Nansen carried them to safety, but safety wasn't something that came easy anymore. Even as the ship's engines hummed steadily and the outer hull gleamed under the distant stars, Thomas could feel the weight of survival pressing on him like an old, familiar burden. They were taken to a recovery station orbiting Proxima Line, a massive ring installation usually reserved for high-profile emergencies and diplomatic interventions. This time, it was the humans from Epsilon 9 who occupied its sterile corridors. The survivors were given rooms with clean sheets and sterile lights, Medics and technicians in polished uniforms took samples, checked vitals, asked questions. Always the questions. How had they survived? What tactics did they use? How had they adapted? The Reach delegates, their bodies encased in shimmering armor and layered exosuits, hovered in observation decks, watching as if humans were specimens in a containment cell. Thomas endured the questions. He answered when necessary, often deflecting the prying inquiries with short, tired phrases. "We worked together," he said again and again. "We used what we had. We didn't leave anyone behind." But inside, something boiled. One day, as he was being escorted through a narrow corridor to yet another debriefing, Thomas stopped. He looked out a window at the stars beyond, countless points of light scattered against a backdrop of endless black. His reflection stared back at him, thinner than he remembered, marked by scars and burns, but still unbroken. Behind him, one of the Calthari delegates, a tall figure with a face like polished stone, cleared its throat. "You were soft skins," it said, its voice a deep rumble. "You should have perished. Your physiology is not designed for reach-level catastrophes, and yet you endured." Thomas turned, meeting the delegate's alien eyes. "We're soft skins," he said quietly, "but we carry each other. We bleed together, and we don't stop when the sky falls. That's what makes us human." The Calthari said nothing more. Word of the Epsilon 9 survivors spread through the orbital station. Engineers from other sectors approached them with questions, soldiers gave them nods of respect, and even the Reach delegates, beings of armor and genetic hardening, watched them differently now. Not with contempt, but with something closer to wary admiration. The survivors weren't just statistics anymore. They were living proof that adaptability wasn't just about physical resilience. It was about determination, about loyalty to one another, about a refusal to die, even when the world crumbled. Weeks passed. Thomas, Sarah, Briggs, Carson, and Henry healed slowly, their bodies stubbornly knitting together fractures and burns. They were offered transport back to Earth or to any human colony of their choosing. Some accepted, some didn't. Briggs, whose leg would never fully heal, chose to stay on the orbital station, helping train new engineers in disaster preparedness. Henry returned to Earth, determined to study emergency medicine, inspired by the brutal lessons of Epsilon 9. Sarah signed up for a terraforming project on a nearby moon, this time determined to make sure no one else was left behind. Carson joined a recovery team, specializing in high-risk evacuations, the kind where others would hesitate. Thomas hesitated the longest. But when he finally stood at the departure bay, waiting for the shuttle to take him back to Earth, he turned to the Calthari delegate who had once mocked him. "Soft skins," Thomas said with a faint smile. "We're just getting started." The Calthari inclined its armored head, acknowledging the quiet defiance in Thomas's voice. The shuttle lifted away from the station, carrying Tomas back toward Earth's pale blue glow. Inside the cabin, as the engines hummed softly and the stars spun past, he finally allowed himself to relax. His body ached with every breath, but his mind was clear. They had survived. Not because of what was in their skin or bones, but because of what was in their hearts. Because when the world turned against them, they turned toward each other. When the Reach species fled, humans dug in, held fast, and refused to die. Epsilon 9 was gone, but its memory would burn bright in every survivor's heart, a testament to human endurance, a warning to those who underestimated them. When the first reports from the rescue teams reached Earth, the headlines didn't read "colony lost" or "human casualties." They read something else entirely. They called us soft-skinned. They were wrong. And beneath those words was an image. A group of battered, scarred humans, standing together amid the wreckage, their faces streaked with dirt and blood, but alive, smiling, very, very human.